Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give just another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started on our webinar. Thanks for joining. Okay, everyone. Well, good afternoon. My name is Scott Bruin. I'm the Director of Tax and Fiscal Policy for Oregon Business and Industry. On behalf of Oregon Business and Industry and the Portland Business Alliance, who we are kind of co-branding this webinar with, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. The issue here has to do with out-of-state taxation, and all that. As when I introduce Nikki, she will go into much more detail. But in this world of COVID, this world of the Great Resignation, this world where we've seen the incredible technology advances with digital video and workspaces, as well as just the fact that we have more and more employees who are from other places, has raised an issue that's been around for a long time. It's not a new issue, but it's an issue that that is new for a lot of companies. This issue came to our attention in I guess the most practical way. We actually have an employee that works out of the state of Oregon, and so this is how this came to our attention. And we thought, after we got together with Business Alliance, we felt that this was something that there was inadequate education out there on it. It's going to catch, we felt would catch a lot of companies by surprise. And so we just wanted to do our best to make sure that that folks had the best and most the most current information available when it comes to how to manage out of state employees as far as withholdings and registrations and everything else. So I'm really grateful today to have Nikki Dobay with us to make the presentation. Nikki is a longtime partner with OBI. She is a partner with Eversheds Sutherland, and has been there about a year and a half, where she's a senior tax partner and lives in Portland, but they're a nationwide concern doing great work in tax policy across the nation. Prior to being with Eversheds Sutherland, Nikki was a senior counsel on state taxation with the Council for State Taxation. And so it's a complicated way of saying that Nikki knows tax policy across the country. I have worked, in my time with OBI, Nikki and I have worked on quite a few issues, and she's really OBI's technical tax expert. She's the one who gets in the weeds of statute, who really understands the rulemaking side of things with the Department of Revenue, and is absolutely an indispensable resource for OBI and our members. And so I am just delighted to have Nikki here today to give this presentation about this important topic that just a lot of people aren't aware of. So with that, Nikki, let me hand the reins to you and all for that. Let me just one other housekeeping thing. So we expect that this webinar will last less than an hour. Nikki will do her presentation, and then please ask questions in the Q&A or the chat function as they come up. We'll also save some time at the end. This webinar, once it's completed, will go on both the PBA and the OBI site, because we expect that there'll be a lot of information here that you may have to refer back to. So with that, Nikki, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for having me today. And don't worry, there are a lot of people that have a lot of difficulty seeing Eversheds, so no worries there. But happy to be here today talking about this. This is definitely a topic that we have been talking with our clients about for a long time. And during my time at Cost, was talking about this topic, but from a really different perspective. And so that's what we'll cover in the introduction, is what are we talking about? Why are we here talking about this today? What's changed over the last 2 years? Spoiler alert, there was a global pandemic and it kind of changed everything. Then we're going to get into kind of the current state of the states on how this is looking across the country. This won't necessarily be completely Oregon specific. The rules do generally apply to Oregon. So we're going to talk about a lot of broader themes, but please do feel free to ask specific Oregon, Washington questions or whatnot, and I will try to answer them uh, during this time, if I can't answer it, I'll definitely get back to you with a follow-up. But we wanted to kind of provide a real broad overview of this topic. And then finally, just a few thoughts at the end of some of the discussions we're having with our clients on this issue and what you should be thinking about if this is a new area for you. So um, with that, just want to talk about, telework and what's the situation. So when I started with cost several years ago, cost was very involved with a federal bill called the Mobile Workforce Bill. And the situation with the Mobile Workforce Bill and why that was so important had to do with folks that were employees that were getting on planes every day and going to conferences or going to employee or client locations and having meetings and working in states that they were not residents of. In that situation, usually the employee would be in a state for, a day, 2 days, 3 days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. And just having an employee in a state for a very limited amount of time can create what we call nexus or these withholding requirements or income tax requirements for the employee. The states are not uniform on this issue. And for a long, long time, this is a very tangled web. And these traveling employees it was very challenging for companies that had traveling employees. Well, I'm sure all of you are well aware and remember the day back in March of 2020 when the world kind of shut down. And so we went from a situation where you had perhaps a lot of employees that were going into states for a couple days at a time and what to do in that situation to all of a sudden, most of your employees weren't leaving their houses. And in the beginning of all this, maybe we didn't have any mobile workforce issues, but as the pandemic went on, we learned a couple things. We learned that we're actually really good at working remotely. And it's something that can be done on a pretty broad scale. And many employees also learned maybe they didn't like living where they lived and they wanted to live somewhere else because now they could do their work from that situation. So during the pandemic, you have a couple camps. One, you've probably got some employees and let's take Portland and Washington as an example. You had some Washington employees that used to come into Portland every day to work in an office in downtown Portland. And throughout the pandemic, they weren't able to do that. And so they were sitting and working from their home in Washington. What are the consequences of that? What did that create? And then maybe you had an employee who lived in Portland, worked in Portland, and decided, hey, you know what? During this whole pandemic thing, I think I'm going to move to Idaho or move to Montana, or maybe I'm going to rent a house in Hawaii and work there for 4 or 5 months. And so we've really just seen a complete 180 in the sense of where are our employees doing their work. And this has really led to, what we categorize as the conundrum, because in the current environment, it is very difficult for employers to be very rigid on where employees are expected to do their work. This is not true across the board, and there are definitely exceptions to that rule and people that are coming back to the offices or intend to come back to the office. But for a lot of companies where remote work has gone just fine, it's going to be more and more difficult to attract and retain talent when you are going to draw a hard line or make an employee work from a particular location. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you're kind of opening up a whole can of worms when it comes to tax exposure and other potential requirements by the company when you have employees working from other states. And so that I didn't even know that slide did that magical thing, but so that's kind of a cool thing. But okay, so here are the potential consequences of having an employee working remotely. And so when we say this, just to kind of level set, what do we mean? So you're an Oregon-based company, and now you have employees that are working, so they're at their home. in another state doing their work. So there are a whole host of issues that can be created. So first and foremost, and even though it's kind of on the lower portion of this slide, and we'll spend some time talking about this, there are employment tax issues. So in states that impose income taxes, there's going to be withholding obligations related to those employees being in the state. And then of course, the employee will likely have income tax obligations, which are their own. And you may think, okay, that's just withholding and, remitting or withholding to another state, no big deal. But having an employee in a different state where you perhaps were not doing any business before can expose a business to other tax consequences. So direct taxes, what do we mean when we think about this? These are income taxes, or for purposes of Washington, the B&O tax, their gross receipts tax. Local licensing, local taxes and licenses. These can be a real trap for the unwary, depending on what particular locality your employee is sitting in. You could now have created what we call nexus and now have a filing obligation or tax obligation in that specific locality. That could be a tax, a specific tax, or a license requirement because you are now considered to be doing business in that locality. Indirect taxes. So these are, and I know as Oregonians, we don't think about these too often, but sales taxes. So taxes that you are required to collect as a seller, and then that get remitted to a state, and you are just the conduit there. Other issues that can be created there, you may have registration requirements or compliance requirements in those states, as well as some non-tax issues or labor laws. So really, and we'll get to a slide that it's not meant to scare you, but it's a little scary. Having just one employee in a state can kind of open the door for the state to say that you now have all these new obligations and are required to comply with their laws. So with respect to withholding, this is an area that's, I will say, not easy to navigate. There's very little consistency among the states on exactly how this works. There are, however, some big themes and how we kind of think of these in general terms. So when you have an employee, you really need to think about withholding mainly in two contexts, and then we have a few exceptions. So first, if you have an employee who is a resident of the state that you're in, you're going to source, or any the resident state of the employee is the state where you are going to be required to withhold on all of their income. So if you have an employee who's working from home, let's just say in the Portland area or outside the Portland area, you will continue to withhold on that employee for Oregon tax purposes. Now let's think about that resident or that employee moving to Washington. They are now considered a non-resident. And now we look to the source column. So for non-residents, only wages that are sourced to the state are subject to withholding. So for purposes of Oregon, if you have a Washington employee that is working from their Washington house, their home in Washington, those wages would not be considered wages sourced to Oregon. And so you would not be required to withhold for Oregon purposes on those wages. Now, if Washington does not have a personal income tax, so then there's no withholding requirement for a Washington resident for income taxes. Let's say, however, that you hire somebody in Idaho. For that employee, they would be considered an Idaho resident, assumingly, and you would be required to withhold on all of their income in Idaho. If they were traveling back and forth, those withholdings could potentially change. So for residents, generally, you're required to withhold on all of their income. For non-residents, you are required to withhold in a state the income, the wages that are sourced to that state. And that's generally based on when the employee is working in a particular state. And so these are the main two rules that we look to, is whether or not you have a resident employee or a non-resident employee. And then we have some exceptions, of course. There are certain states that have reciprocity rules between them that allow this to be a little more seamless. There's a rule that we are unfortunately have to talk about, but we don't, we think it's a bad rule. It's called the convenience of the employer rule. This is generally a rule employed in a handful of southeastern states. I think there's 5 states that currently maintain this rule, and Nebraska is one of those states, and there is legislation pending that would repeal that rule. So we'd be down to only 4 states, which would be a very good thing. The convenience of the employer rule gets a little bit trickier. It generally requires withholding on all of a non-resident's income, unless that employee is in a different state for purposes of the convenience of the employer. And I won't belabor this rule because we really do not see it here when we're thinking about kind of the Oregon-Washington divide. But it is a rule that is out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the context of some litigation that has recently been pending. There's also some federal laws for very specific types of employees that could potentially apply here, and kind of trump any of the state's general withholding rules. But these are very complicated rules. And so you really do need to know where your employees are domiciled, where they are residents of, and whether or not they're traveling between states and doing their work for purposes of where their income could be sourced. During COVID, we saw a lot of states, because as you can see, if pre-COVID you had kind of a withholding methodology in place, and much of that was based on just what offices your employees were assigned to. And then COVID happened, and now we saw many more employees that were working from home, most employees working from home, and many of those employees were working now across state lines. And so for most of the pandemic, we saw a lot of states issue guidance or temporary guidance that essentially said, let's just keep the status quo in place. So let's just, however you were doing it before the pandemic, just keep doing that. And you will be held harmless, essentially. Most of this guidance that was provided during the pandemic has expired, because in many situations it was based on when there was a state of emergency or some other thing going on related to COVID. And so many of the protections that were provided by this interim guidance, or emergency guidance, if you will, have essentially fallen by the wayside. But that was an approach that many states took during the pandemic. One state in particular that took this approach was the state of Massachusetts. And what Massachusetts said was, well, there were a lot of people coming into our state that were working here before. We understand they can't do that anymore. I think in some places they weren't even allowed to do that anymore. But they said, but that's okay. Just continue to withhold as if they're working in Massachusetts every day. And the state of New Hampshire didn't really like that. They, similar to Washington, do not have an income tax. And so the state of New Hampshire sued the Massachusetts Commonwealth on this issue in the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. And this case, ultimately, the court rejected, and it did not hear the case. But what this case was really trying to get at was essentially this convenience of the employer test. And this wasn't the perfect vehicle for a challenge of that test, but because it was a temporary rule that Massachusetts had put into place, and also the Supreme Court said that the New Hampshire residents could ultimately sue on their own behalf if they wanted to. But what this case really did highlight and bring to the surface is how difficult these rules are and the fairness related to these rules. So here you can imagine a situation where you have New Hampshire residents that may never set foot in Massachusetts again, and Massachusetts is wanting those employers to continue to withhold that tax on their behalf. So, so there have been several things that have highlighted the challenges in this area, and there are also currently some cases pending in New York related to their convenience of the employer test. So we could see, litigation in the future, cases in the future, and courts determining whether or not that test is still constitutional. But at the end of the day, it is true that just having a single employee in a state will essentially create taxing nexus for a company. It's not the only way that a company can create nexus, but this will kind of get you. And so this is really something that you need to think about as you have employees that are requesting to work remotely, or maybe you don't know if they're working remotely in this current situation. This is an area that the federal government has taken a look at for many, many years. During the years when I was at COST, there was a bill called the Mobile Workforce Bill that was continually introduced and made significant progress, but never made it across the finish line. That would have addressed that traveling employee situation. But then when COVID hit, we again had this different situation. And so in 2021, there was legislation introduced, the Remote and Mobile Worker Relief Act, and that would have created a bright line test. Although it's challenging to see how federal legislation can completely address an issue where, because that would have allowed protection for an employee being in a state for say 60, 90 days. But what about if you have an employee just in a state on a permanent basis? And there, I'm not sure legislation can really change anything in that context. So what are you supposed to do in this situation? So we love this slide because that's just a really cute elephant. And it's important to understand what you need to be thinking about if you are going to allow your employees to continue to work remotely. It's really all about the policies and procedures that you have in place. So, again, prior to COVID, most of the policies really focused on, traveling employees, and, maybe there were certain day counting policies that you had in place, and that was how a company dealt with that. Now you've really got to take a look at those policies and review them and make sure, that they're coherent and understandable and everybody knows what they are, but also, do they work for the business? And in particular, you do have to think about what are these policies going to create on the tax side. So, some may say they're definitely going to create challenges, but opportunities for the tax group. So understanding, knowing where your footprint is, your business footprint, where are you currently filing? Where do you maybe not want to ever file? So maybe you would not allow an employee in a particular state because you just don't want to create that nexus there. So this kind of goes to those ideas, really just thinking about what are the short-term and permanent goals. So, I think companies have been trying to deal with what is our return to office situation going to look like? That's been a roller coaster for 9 months or so now, maybe a year for many companies, as employers try to figure out what's going on with return to office. It's also probably a good time to make decisions about where do you want your employees working? Are you going to be flexible with remote work? And what are your policies going to look like on that front? And again, really kind of thinking through the potential exposure that you are opening the company up to by going fully remote, or maybe you could put some additional limitations on that. So just thinking through these issues in a really thorough way. And then as you're thinking through the states, even understand, what are those state rules? What do they expose you to? For example, a state like Washington, with a gross receipts tax, that's a much different animal than just looking at what your potential, corporate income tax liability could be. So a lot of things to think about. So the next step is really to, once you have your goals in mind, just developing these policies and procedures, your teleworking policy, as well as your traveling worker policy, and making sure that everybody just understands what those are. And then really the real most important thing is just making sure that these are implemented, and that these policies are you are sticking with these policies and you are monitoring these policies. So does that mean you're going to have employees verify where they are working from every year? Those types of things. What are you going to do to make sure that the policies and procedures that you've set up and put into place are working, and that you're maintaining them, and that if a state comes in and audits you, that you will have the information you need to back that up. So just a few other things to think about. Again, I've mentioned the business traveler multiple times. You really need to kind of balance these two issues, because I think as we're going to come back to the office, we're going to have remote workers, and then you're also going to have people traveling again. So for your business, what makes the most sense to sync up all of these issues, and just making sure that you're thinking about this in a holistic manner. And then finally, a couple things to just also have on your radar. So the state and local tax landscape has really changed significantly over the last 5 years or so. So it used to be that having a physical presence in a state was what was required for the most part to create nexus. Here, having that employee in the state would create that physical presence nexus, and that's what we're kind of sitting here talking about today, in addition to all the withholding issues. But there are several other ways that a business can also create nexus in another state. And that's just through, the number of sales you may have into a state. That can create nexus. In Washington, that is a very low threshold, just $100,000 in sales. And then there's also been a significant shift in how the states are looking at a federal law that has traditionally provided protection for workers or solicitation in states, and that's Public Law 86-272. So here we now see states getting very aggressive on this issue, and so here, even you may have an employee in a state, they may just be soliciting sales. You may think you have the Public Law 86-272 protection under the federal law, and a state may challenge you on that based on some new guidance. So it's kind of a scary world out there on the state and local tax front. I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but there's just a lot to think about. And so just know, as you expand your footprint through sales, through your workforce, and other means, there's just more and more risk on the state and local tax side. So Scott, I will pause there and see if we've got any specific questions. If you want to chat about anything
I
else.
do. Well, first of all, Nikki, thank you so much. I mean, I think, the more we know, the more we realize how much more we need to know, right? And that leads to the first question that we'd have is how are, I mean, great, we thank you for this. People can access this webinar, but does the State Department of Revenue have good resources around this in your, I guess, experience so far? And I'm not trying to call out the DOR. I'm just legitimately, curious how they are on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the challenge on this front, Scott. They've got some great resources on what a business will have to do for purposes of Oregon withholding, but they don't tell you what you need to do in the other states. The states, because their laws are so different, it's very challenging for them to provide guidance on, what another state's law is. And frankly, they're very hesitant to do that because it kind of exposes them to risk. So you're not going to find a lot of great guidance out there from the Oregon Department of Revenue on these rules. And this is not, I don't operate on the, the other employment tax side too much. There may be better rules with respect to some of those payroll taxes in that context, because there is a lot more reciprocity between the states and they seem to work together a little bit better. So I think on some of the payroll taxes, there's better resources, but for just purposes of the withholding, I would say the resources aren't great, although we did get some guidance recently from the Department of Revenue, just with respect to withholding for Oregon purposes. And it did, make clear that for purposes of withholding, employers are only required to withhold based on the days worked in the state. So they of course can offer other withholding if they would like, but so they have recently provided that, which I think is helpful information.
Excellent, thank you. Alyssa asked a great question about, she mentions that they've got employees in San Francisco. And so this seems particularly concerning given new homelessness GRT, or I guess there's two ways to look at that. There is Oregon looking at California, but then I'm also concerned about, what about the employee that lives in California or that lives in Washington, however, that has the, that lives in Portland, with the local issues, how are, we've talked about the state taxation, but how about the local issues? How does this work in that mix, Nikki?
It essentially works the same. So, and interestingly, local tax jurisdiction is even wonkier than state tax jurisdiction. And again, if you've got an employee sitting in that jurisdiction, if that jurisdiction knows about it, they're sure as heck gonna take the position that you've established nexus and are now subject to that tax. It depends also, there's a lot of factors that go into this overall calculation. For, something like an income tax or a GRT, are you selling into those jurisdictions? Perhaps you don't have any sales there. So you have an employee that wants to live in San Francisco, but all of your stuff you sell into Oregon and Washington. Again, the risk is mitigated just by the fact that you're not going to probably have any direct tax exposure. So having that person there, it's more just a function of, can you deal with the withholding requirements and all those obligations? And maybe there isn't a significant risk, but it is true that literally, you've got to almost look at this on a case-by-case basis in many situations. And I think that's particularly true for smaller businesses where, the exposure could really tip the scale on compliance burdens versus, does this make sense on a business for business purposes? So it is just really, there's a lot of questions to ask when somebody says, hey, can I work from that place?
And as you say, it could be as little as one employee creates that nexus with other state. I guess in hindsight, I guess looking at this, it's maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but it's slightly better to have the Washington resident working in Portland than the Portland resident working in Washington as far as the tax side. I think Portland's a little more complicated at this point than Clark County.
Right. Yes. And I mean, that's true. So, Washington employers that have people that are, living in downtown Portland, working in downtown Portland, they're going to have to, I think the local withholding rules that I'm kind of speaking I'm a little out over my skis. I believe those only apply if you're physically in, like the employer is also physically in the jurisdiction. So, but if they, do have a location within the jurisdiction, then they would have to comply with all those withholding rules. But I mean, that's what makes this whole area so challenging is consistent rules would be great, but they all just have their like, well, this is the general rule, but then this has this, weird little tweak to it.
Let me flip it around because we're looking at this from, as we should be, from an employer perspective. But of course, a lot of, all of us employers have key employees. Every employee is a key employee. Any advice or thoughts that we should be giving employees in this regard? So for the Oregon-based company who has the employee or two that work in Clark County or work in San Francisco, what should we as employers be talking about with those employees to make sure they're protected?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, the employer's responsibility is their withholding obligation. And that is what could subject the employer to potential penalties and interest. So just, I think when I advise, and I do advise employers, and then I also advise individuals in this area. So, but when I am advising an employer, the withholding rules are kind of the holy grail. And that's why getting that guidance from the state of Oregon that for withholding purposes, we look at the day count. We look at when an employee is physically within the state, no matter who they are. Now, this is not always the answer HR wants or some of the other folks in management want, because they want to make their employees happy. They don't want to make their lives difficult. Nobody wants to get their, fill out their tax return, have TurboTax spit it out and realize that they, potentially didn't pay enough. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. So I do always start with understand what your withholding obligations are. That's kind of that's what you need to fall within, because otherwise you could be opening yourselves up to penalties and interest. And those are scary penalties and interest, because they come after the big guys in the corporation, in the business. Then it becomes more of a question of, okay, now if do you need to work on creating some other levers, do additional withholding if certain folks would want that, and how do you go about that? But that's kind of, it's a needle that has to be threaded. And even just thinking about all the local taxes, they've made that very difficult, because the thresholds they don't really match with what the personal income tax thresholds are. And I have to imagine, because I've definitely advised employers that these are the rules, this is what you need to follow. Somebody's going to get a tax bill and they're not going to be happy. And so in any correspondence to your employees, making clear that this is not tax advice, they should talk to their tax preparer. And these are our obligations, and just making that very clear that you're not making, you're not providing tax advice to them on what they should be doing, that everybody's tax situation is different.
We'll start wrapping this up. And again, as we do that, I'd like to invite, if there's any last questions, like to invite people to either put it in the Q&A or the chat. And Nikki, as people are thinking about that, let me just kind of, my last question, at least, you mentioned that there has been conversation about federal legislation for a long time. As you and I were discussing earlier, there is a bill out there right now. It's a bipartisan bill. I won't ask you to give me your prospects about whether it passes, but I guess my question to you is, I know that you attend, lots of tax seminars, and you have lots of colleagues that are well versed in this issue. Does this get us there? I mean, is this a good fix? Does it create more problems than it solves? I mean, those sorts of general questions on the federal legislation.
Yeah, Scott, it's a fascinating, complicated question. I don't I don't like crystal balling, but this is what I'll say. I don't think we're going to see anything in the near future.
Yeah.
But I think this is an area there's a lot of momentum building for there to be some, greater uniformity. We see employers at this point, we don't even know how return to office is going to work. I mean, how many times has it been pushed out now? So I feel like we're waiting to see what happens with return to office. Does the issue, I don't think it's going to go away, but is this burden alleviated? Because 50-70% of the workforce comes back to the office, and we're back to kind of the good old days for the most part.
Yep.
I don't think that's probably where we're going to end up. So I think we're going to see, again, there's a couple cases in New York that are challenging the convenience of the employer test. I think we're going to have to watch those play out. I hope that one of them gets to the Supreme Court. There's also something that I've been recently working on called the Fair Coalition, this would be a push for a federal bill that would modify the Tax Injunction Act, which would allow more taxpayers to get into federal court, which is, I'll just say taxpayers often have challenges when they have to go to state tax courts and try to litigate these issues. So we could see, more taxpayers getting into federal court, more businesses just struggling to comply. I think after COVID, there's going to be a lot of audits in this area. The states traditionally couldn't really audit on the business traveler side. But it's going to be easier when your guy was sitting somewhere for 12 months, 18 months, and you probably have some cell phone records of that. So I think it could come to a head at some point, and then that could, I'd love to see federal legislation. I love federal legislation on state tax issues. That's great. There are also currently efforts at the state level through organizations like COST to try to provide some greater uniformity. So last year there was a bill passed in Arkansas. There's legislation pending in Arizona, I believe. And the way the bill works is it's based on, a bunch of states having the same legislation.
Yeah.
So we're just at the beginning of that, but that's kind of the next push to just provide some greater uniformity, because at least if the state language is all the same, the rules should be all the same, and it does simplify the process. But that's a long time coming. So I wouldn't hold your breath and put your head in the sand till that happens. Yeah.
Nikki Dobay, Eversheds Sutherland. I got it right that time, didn't I? Without footnotes. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We want to thank everybody on behalf of, again, both OBI and PBA. Want to thank everybody for joining today. Again, Nikki's little seminar here was recorded, so within a day or so it will go up on our website and PBA's website as well, so you can refer back to it. And I guess be aware is any last parting takeaway thought, Nikki?
No, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. This is just an area that's it's always one where every time somebody's like, talk about this, I'm like, oh, then I just leave and everybody's mad at me. But do reach out to Scott or me. My contact information is in the slides. If you've got specific questions, send them to Scott, send them to me. We're here to be a resource. And but
don't shoot the messenger is what you're saying.
Hold on to your hat. It's about to get, this is about to become a real wild ride. So.
All right, Nikki, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.